is yours.
Thank you so much, Ted. Welcome everyone to this very special session titled Beyond Merit, which I think is very timely for reasons that I'll explain in a second. I'm really very pleased with the speakers that we have lined up today. It's a conversation between political theory and sociology. We are each using very different methods to approach this crucial question that is the centrality of meritocracy in our society and the damages that it does to people's mental health and to the way that our societies are able and not able to think about solidarity and redistribution. So we have two sociologists, and Jonathan Mijs and Steffen Mao. Jonathan is a recent graduate from the Department of Sociology at Harvard. He's currently a lecturer in our department, but he will be starting in the fall as assistant professor in sociology at Boston University. And he's also a Mary Skłodowska-Curie Fellow at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. He is working on a book for University of California Press titled the Inequality Paradox, Why the Growing Gap Leaves Us Less Concerned. So the book is very much about inequality and how we react to growing inequality. Our second speaker is Steffen Mao, who was visiting Harvard a few years ago and who is a member of the research cluster on comparative inequality and inclusion. He is professor of macrosociology at the Institute of Social Science at Humboldt University in Berlin. And his most recent book is The Matrix Society on the Quantification of the Social. And I'm very delighted to share with you the news that he received the Leibniz Prize from the German Science Foundation a few months ago, which is awarded for outstanding achievement in science worldwide. So it's one of the most distinguished honor that scientists can receive in Germany. So I was very glad to learn that he was awarded this prize. Finally, Michael Sandel does not need any introduction, but I'll introduce him nevertheless. He's the Antti and Robert M. Bass Professor of Government at Harvard. He's also faculty associate of the Weatherhead Center. He's, of course, exceptionally prolific, and he's going to be discussing his most recent book, The Tyranny of Merit, What Becomes of the Common Good. And I should say that a few years ago, an anecdote, I was visiting Hangzhou in China in 2013, and in the bookshelves, in the bookstore of the airport, you had Michael Sandel's book, What Money Can Buy, all over the bookstore. And then I was invited to give a talk at one of these high school for students, very ambitious students who to be studying abroad. They're called School of Foreign Languages. And I was invited to speak with high school students there. And here we are in this huge room packed with students, and all the questions they were asking me, they were citing Michael Sandel's book. So I thought this is really an ability to shape the conversation at the transnational level that is absolutely exceptional. So that's one reason why I was partly thrilled when I discovered a few years ago that he was writing on the tyranny of merit, in part because that's a topic I've spent some time working on. I published in 2000 a book titled The Dignity of Working Man, which compares how workers in France and the US understand their relationship with the upper middle class, including their expertise. And of course, with the election of Trump, that's a question that has become even more salient. So today we still face the context of growing inequality, at the same time as COVID is making the contradiction, the tensions within our society even more acute, as essential workers are experiencing the conditions, the effect of COVID on their life conditions so much more acutely than the upper middle class, all of us who are in the comfort of our home now on Zoom as we are working. And we know that the values of the upper middle class are, especially in the US, constantly presented as desirable, as something that everyone should aspire to, although the conditions that make them available to people are becoming less and less available to everyone. So it's a particularly good moment to ask ourselves, at the time when there's a booming mental health crisis, not only in the upper middle class, but of course in the working class as well, as manifested. You know, the opioid epidemic is one of the manifestations. So it's partly a good time to ask ourselves, how are we going to move forward in a context where the narratives about what defines the legitimate self, who we're supposed to be, is becoming is quite narrow, and fewer people can actually meet these standards. So this is a conversation I hope we're going to have today. And these are topics about which there's a long tradition in sociology, but Michèle is approaching these questions through a perspective of political theory that I think is really broadening the conversation in very interesting ways. So the structure of the conversation today will be that each of our three speakers are going to speak for 10 minutes or so. This will be followed by a short exchange between us, and then we're going to be at the end opening a Q&A for the audience as well. So the order will be first Steffen Mao, then Jonathan Mijs, and then Michèle Sandel. So Steffen, would you like to get us started?
Yes, thanks, Michèle, for the invitation and also for the kind introduction. I share my screen with you here. Second, I have to. It worked before, and I guess we will. So that was the wrong one. Okay, here we go. Do you see me? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, this is still the wrong one. So now we start. So I give the title of my short talk is the different or many worlds of meritocracy, and I would like to put forward an argument that the understanding of merit, or what is meritable, differs across countries, maybe even across groups. It's not a uniform concept, but a concept that is very much determined by institutional and social context. And I give a very short introduction to the overall theme. So what is the problem, or what is the issue with meritocracy? And then I turn to a few empirical qualitative data. Most sociologists know the book by Michael Young. That's a classic, invented the term meritocracy, and claimed so this is IQ plus efforts equals merit. It was basically a satiric book. Some people took it face value, but nevertheless the term has become very successful as a form of legitimizing inequality in our society. And most of the working on that issue, of course, they point out that we move away, or have moved away, from a descriptive society where the origin matters very much, or the family background, to an individual achievement society where your place in the social order depends very much on your actual performance. And the relation between meritocracy and inequality is twofold, I would say. So in first place, you have an argument for selecting people for specific positions in the social hierarchy. So therefore it can legitimize mobility, but you also have a form of legitimizing inequality in terms of unequal rewards or forms of gratification depending on the position you are in. And usually we have four components we look at, and this is a relation between social economic background and educational attainment. Both should be decoupled. you should have a close coupling between educational attainment and occupational position. So the higher your education, the better your skills, better should be the position in the labor market, and you should have a close nexus between occupational positions and income. And the transmission bells for that kind of linkage is not only the market, not a pure market, because the market does not really care about performance, but has many other rationals which play out there. But the educational system is very central, labor markets and organizations with hierarchical positional systems. There's a very nice book, only in German, by Klaus Offe. It's his dissertation, where he worked on the so-called achievement principle, how we call it in Germany, in industrial societies. It's still a very interesting and inspiring book. I can only recommend for those reading German. And of course, there are many pitfalls related to meritocracy. One is, of course, the background assumptions that there should be a kind of equality of opportunity, and we should have a perfect competitive situation that is hardly ever given. Basically, the principle of meritocracy is somehow restrained and depends very much on these kind of conditions, which are often not addressed explicitly. There's also an inherent functionalism, because the assumption here is, of course, that society is basically organized in functional terms, and also that performance matters very much. What I call here performance tautology, what do I mean by that? It's very often we think that people at the highest social level or with bigger incomes, they deserve that because we think that this is an indicator of performance. So we basically equate performance and potential outcomes. We had a discussion in the German context also about the rise of success ideologies, so that we move away from achievement to success related to the emergence of winner-take-all markets and the concentration, of course, of success and rewards. One key problem, and I think Michèle will take that up too, is of course within the ideology of meritocracy, there's no argument for a just degree of inequality. So it could be any kind of difference between status group or in terms of rewards that can be seen as legitimate. So there's no fixed benchmark for justifying one or the other form. And of course, the link to social mobility is also opaque. The measurement of achievement is relatively unclear. So it's quite a problematic concept and not easy to operationalize. If we look at the acceptance cross-nationally, I do not have data for the US here because I just look at 4 European countries, UK, Germany, Norway, and Slovenia. We see that at least in Germany and UK, most people think that large differences in income are acceptable to reward talents and efforts. It's a bit less in Norway. In Slovenia, we hardly or find just a minority of people believing in that principle, which is also very interesting. I do not explain that here. In the following, I draw on data which we took from so-called mini publics or deliberative forums, which we run in different countries. It's of course a consortium of different researchers and research groups, where we invited people to discuss issues of social policy, inequality, meritocracy for 2 times, or with 30 people, around 30 people for 2 days. So they discussed 8 or 9 hours in a row. And so we exploited these data to get an idea of what meritocracy means to them, because what is meritable can vary quite substantially. So the time spent for producing something, work efforts, education or occupation, risk-taking investment, so if you think about markets, or even contribution to society. I have a big table here. I hope you can see it a little bit, but I will explain just few points or few findings which we had. Starting with the case of UK, I said, so the acceptance of meritocracy is relatively high. If people talk about meritocracy or related stuff, they usually refer to a kind of market success ideology. They think what comes out of the market is just and can be considered as related to a meritocratic type of redistribution or distribution. I'm not reading it out here, you can read it on your own, but this is a typical sentence which we derived from it. And of course, related to that is some skepticism in relation to welfare benefits. The issue of deserving and undeserving is very high on the agenda. We also found differences between higher and lower status groups. I mean, this goes basically true for most of the Western countries. Of course, the higher status groups are more affirmative in relation to
Well, it
to
looks
Germany. Like it's interesting that they have an Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Yeah, okay, sorry. They have an understanding of meritocracy that is very much work and skill based. It also comes from the strong standing of the vocational vocational training system in Germany. It comes from the system of salaries and the close link between the educational system and the labor market. So most people would think that there should be a proportional relation between skills, training, education people have, and the type of work you do, but also the money you receive for that. Thirdly, Norway. In Norway, we found mixed support for the principle of meritocracy. They also refer to individual work effort, but at the same time, in Norway, also what we call social utility or contribution to the common good plays a role that we did not find that in the UK, neither in the UK nor in Germany. And we term that common good meritocracy. In Slovenia, last case, as you have seen before, low support for meritocracy. It was basically absent, not a salient issue in all the group discussions. Most people were skeptical that these people can be put into practice at all. They complained about corrupt elites. They did not believe that there could be something like an ordered or systematic form of distribution of rewards or forms of remuneration. Overall, okay, yeah, here a few quotations. So overall, what is the message I would like to convey here? So what is merit differs quite substantially, so across countries, but partly also across groups. So these notions, they depend very much on institutional, historical, country-specific context. We use the term in the paper I present here, moral repertoires. So Michèle has a term, cultural repertoires, and we thought that is a specific situation where people in the countries can draw on in understanding of meritocracy that basically is entrenched in the institutional context. And last sentence maybe, so the argument would be there is no unified and straightforward concept of meritocracy that is applied all over the place. Thank you.
This is great. Thank you so much, Steffen. So now we're going to have a little conversation between the speakers, and I'll just throw in a question to get us started. I mean, Slovenia really stands out as in how different it is from the other 4 cases you looked at. And in Norway, you have what you call common group meritocracy. Is that what you said?
Common good meritocracy.
Common group, good. Yeah, I cannot read my own handwriting. So Jonathan wrote a wonderful paper published in Socius that documents patterns of growth of belief in meritocracy from 1930 to 2010 across 25 Western societies, and in 3 countries only does he find a decline in belief in meritocracy: Canada, Austria, and France. And then you have the case of the former socialist society. So I'd like to ask you to speculate about whether there's what brings together, would Slovenia be like other former Soviet societies, and what might connect it to Canada, Austria, and France in this moral repertoire, and what feeds the moral repertoire?
Yeah, I think, for Central and Eastern Europe, it's most likely, of course, the historical transition. So they came from a system where political loyalty and other forms of being part of society played out when you wanted to enter a position or to gain a position. So it was not always related to performance or individual achievement. And most of these people, they believe when they enter a market economy, that will change drastically. I can report from the East German case that people thought, now we are part of a market society, and now it will become more just. In other words, more meritocratic. That was the belief. And most people were disappointed. It's not the same in all countries, but in many countries, of course, you have a very fast creation of oligarchies. So where a few people basically gained most of the share, and where skill did not matter anymore that much. There was mass unemployment where people thought they have very good skills, did not basically gain a position again, so they were falling out of the system. So that could be a reason. As for Canada and France, maybe Jonathan can interpret these cases much better, as I haven't looked at them. But what is somehow striking is that the disappointment of meritocracy does not always lead to a decline in support. In some cases it does, in other cases it doesn't, so people start to believe even more in that. And I think it would be interesting to see, besides these figures of averages, whether disappointments or detachment from the principle is basically carried by specific groups, like the lower class people or working class people who do not believe in that kind of system anymore.
Great, thank you. Would Jonathan or Michael like to raise a point?
Yeah, sure. I think your point about disappointment is really well taken, and the different sort of things you can take from that. In the United States, we're familiar with this term of a temporarily embarrassed millionaire, which is sort of a way of coping with not having quite achieved your economic success that you're looking for, but suspending that expectation and not letting your current position in any way impact your belief in the American dream or in American meritocracy more generally. But as you're describing, these perceptions and these beliefs and these practices very much differ from country to country, of course. I think the Slovenian case is really interesting because if I'm correct, from all the former Yugoslav republics, Slovenia is actually doing the best economically speaking, is also the most economically equal of the different republics. I think it's Serbia that has the highest levels of inequality. So you have here a country where, relatively speaking, certainly in immediate comparison with their neighbor countries, they're actually doing quite well and have managed to set up society fairly equally. But that's not at all what their perceptions are, right? So the reality and perception are quite disconnected. And I was wondering, is there something that we can learn from making such a comparison between East and West Germany, as you started to make? Like what are the current beliefs in these different societies, and how do those align with real economic trends? Could you say something about that?
I mean, in most Central and Eastern European countries, you still have a very strong commitment to the role of the state and forms of redistribution. That even Germany is divided on these kind of issues. So if you ask East German people what they think was good in the former GDR, then they still would claim, yeah, it's social policy, people were more equal. So it's a very strong ideal that has basically been carried on to some extent, and people are relatively critical. But you also have people, you could call them winners of transformation, who have an extremely strong commitment and understanding that everything is self-achieved, even if they have made basically windfall profits due to the situation they were in. And yeah, the Slovenian case, I mean, we have collaborators in Slovenia and researchers we were working in, and they said the same. So it's not a dominant issue in the society. People, everyone looks for himself. People are even willing to bribe others to get good certificates or a good position. They have very strong networks, which are important to get ahead in life. And this, of course, counteracts any type of meritocracy you could think of.
If I could, Steffen, first, this is fascinating research, and I have so many questions I would like to ask you, but let me ask you this one about Germany and hard work, a meritocracy defined in terms of effort and hard work. This is intriguing because effort and hard work is, in some ways, a stand-in or an expression for the underlying moral appeal of meritocracy, which has to do with the idea you just mentioned, that everything is self-achieved, that I'm an individual agent capable of controlling my destiny, that I am responsible for my success or the lack of it. So my question is this: do you, in comparing the UK and Germany, both ranked high when you asked about large differences in income being acceptable to reward talents and efforts. Both the UK and Germany were just over 50% agreeing with that. But then you draw the distinction later in how they conceive merit, a market-based idea in the case of Britain, and an effort or work-based idea in the case of Germany, if I have that right. And yet, one of the surveys I looked at when I was writing The Tyranny of Merit, that looked at international comparisons, was the Pew Global Attitudes Survey. And they asked the question in various countries, how important is hard work in determining who succeeds? And of those who said very important, in the US, 73%, maybe not surprising. In the UK, 60%. In Germany, only 49%. And then France was 25%, maybe that's less surprising. But the German one, it seems surprising, especially in the light of your findings. And then when they asked, which is a question that gets directly at this idea of individual agency, responsibility for our success in life. Is success in life determined by forces outside our control? In the US, most people say no. Deep belief in individual effort. 57% said no, it's not determined by forces outside our control. In the UK, 55%, similar. In Germany, only 31%, overwhelmingly. By more than 2 to 1 in Germany, people agreed with the statement that success in life is determined by forces outside our control. Now, those might be bad surveys. I don't know. You know better than I do. But how do you fit these attitudes toward work and agency with what you've found about meritocratic ideas focused on effort and hard work in Germany?
I can try. I mean, one thing that is important probably for the German UK or even maybe German US comparison is that in Germany there's a widespread skepticism of extremely rich people showing off with what they have. And then people in Germany would immediately ask, where does it come from? Is it justified? Is there hard work behind that? Or was it just a lucky person? And when I talk about hard work, it's not a dishwasher to millionaire story. It's more a story of being part of a laborious society. So working in an enterprise, in a corporate environment, in a firm, waking up early in the morning, going there every day, being diligent. These kind of issues are very important. So basically, the institutional context in Germany is that if you have a certain degree, you get a very specific occupational rank. You cannot move up in most enterprises, but also in public sector with a relatively low education degree. You're basically, you stick to the level you are in. And so it's not a fully open rank situation. You have a very close connection between the educational system and the labor market position you find yourself in. And I think the argument that it's beyond your own control means that basically the institutional context has to warrant these kind of linkages between what you do in the educational system and what you get at the labor market. And this is not fully individualized. It's not a free market where you can find your luck, but it's something that needs to be organized socially. And I think this kind of organization is seen as being beyond control, but it's also an expectation people have towards the state agencies and the institutional environment they live in.
Thank you so much for the very interesting presentation, Steffen. Now we're going to turn to Jonathan Mijs.
Can everyone see my screen? Okay, great. Really appreciate the invitation to speak at this Weatherhead forum on such a timely and an important topic, which is, of course, what I'm going to be saying, because this is the topic that I spend so much time thinking about and doing research on. What I'll be doing in the next 10 minutes or so is try to paint a picture of the puzzle that I believe is confronting highly unequal societies like the United States, namely, why aren't people more upset, more angry, more concerned about inequality? And then I'll present to you my attempt to solve this puzzle. So let's dive right in. As we're probably all very much aware, since the 70s and 80s, income gains have been concentrated with a small group in our society whose fortunes have grown at a much faster pace than the rest of us. Basically across the West, income inequalities started growing quite steeply some 50 years ago, peaking in the late 2000s, at which point we had effectively returned to the state of inequality that characterized the Great Depression of the 1920s and 30s. Now, the trend is most pronounced in the United States, but I don't consider the US to be an outlier, and in what follows, you'll see why. Now, this very dramatic rise in inequality has not gone unnoticed. Sociologists have been documenting these trends since their very start in the 70s and 80s. And while it may have taken a while, in recent years, certainly their work has received a lot of attention in the press, in politics, and in public conversation more generally. So you could conclude, indeed, as this cartoon does, that inequality finds itself squarely on the public agenda. But while this cartoon may very much mirror what is our perception of a growing salience of this topic of inequality, that may not be exactly what the general public thinks. In fact, whereas scholars document the reality of growing inequalities, I have yet to see convincing empirical evidence that people are indeed growing increasingly concerned. So consider, for instance, the long record of worries about economic inequality in the United States. These are data from the ISSP, which is arguably the best source for studying attitudes about inequality over time from an international perspective. Now, these data show no sign that people have grown increasingly concerned in the last 50 years. In fact, if we take it together with the trends in income inequality, it appears that as inequality has grown, people have actually become less concerned about it. And meanwhile, they have become more convinced that theirs is a meritocratic society. So we find ourselves currently at a time and a place where with peak levels of inequality, whereas worries about inequality are at a historic low. Now, things could change, of course, because of the pandemic and its disproportionate impact on low-income communities. But as I will argue, there are some very good reasons to temper our expectations. For starters, if we look at concerns about inequality in different societies and set it off against the actual level of inequality in those places, we do not find higher levels of concern in more unequal places. We find the opposite. People in some of the most unequal countries like the UK, the US, Australia are actually the least concerned. And when we ask about social mobility, we find a similar cluster of countries that includes the UK, the US, and China, where people think that there is a lot of social mobility in their society, whereas in fact, these are some of the least socially mobile places on the planet. So in many settings, it would seem that perceptions of inequality are quite disconnected from reality. People are simply just not aware of how unequal their society is. Consider, for instance, Michael Norton's surveys on salary differences. So when Americans were asked how much more a CEO should make than a ground level worker, people on average said 7. A CEO should make about 7 times what a ground level worker does. When they were asked how much they think a CEO actually makes, people put the income ratio at about 30 to 1. They think a CEO makes about 30 times what a ground level worker does. Now, the real number is closer to 350 to 1, which is of course quite far removed from where people would like it to be. But crucially, it's also quite far removed from what most people think it is. And other research describes similar misperceptions about wealth inequality, about racial inequality, about health inequalities. Okay, so if the problem is people's misperceptions, what about we just provide them with better information? How about we just give them the facts? Now, that's exactly what a number of recent survey experiments have asked. In these studies, a treatment group receives facts about inequality, social mobility, basically the kinds of graphs that I've been showing you. And then their views are compared to a control group that doesn't have access to this information. Now, unfortunately, the findings of these studies are, well, give us reason to pause. Some studies find that when you correct people's misperception about inequality, it changes their attitudes. Others find that facts may heighten concerns, but very much leave their political preferences and attitudes unaffected. Yet other studies find that when you tell people about the actual level of inequality in their society, you normalize it. People become more accepting and more tolerant of inequality. So for some people, when they learn about high levels of inequality, they become less concerned. My own survey experiments in Australia, Indonesia, and Mexico suggest that the context, national and local, very much in line with Steffen Maus' research, is maybe a very much neglected aspect of this cognitive focus on what people think and what they know. Now, to sum up, so far, inequalities are on the rise across the Western world, but there's no real evidence of growing concerns. In fact, as I have begun to show, residents of more unequal societies are generally less concerned than people in more egalitarian countries. How do we make sense of this paradox? Now, to solve this puzzle, I argue it requires us to take a closer look at exactly how inequality impacts our society, where those misperceptions come from, and why people continue to hold these meritocratic beliefs. And to get there, I think we need to ask a different question, which is, how does inequality shape the context in which we learn about our society? Specifically, how have 50-some years of growing inequality shaped and reshaped our social lives, the networks that we're part of, our neighborhoods, our schools, our workplaces? Now, if we build on the work of my colleagues in sociology, demography, education, network science, I think we can come a long way towards solving this puzzle. So what I argue is that inequality increases the distance between rich and poor. Rich and poor increasingly live their lives in separate neighborhoods, separate schools, different workplaces, and they befriend, date, and marry people only from within their own social economic circles. So as such, highly unequal societies provide fewer opportunities for people to cross economic fault lines and to develop an understanding of the extent as well as the causes of economic inequality. In the absence of meaningful interactions across the economic divide, people really cannot see the full extent of inequality, nor do they recognize their own privileges or the ways in which they are structurally disadvantaged. So it's not that people hold an unwarranted belief in meritocracy despite the unequal society that they live in. It is because of their unequal society that they see the world the way that they do. Now, to visualize this social life of inequality that I speak of, these then are the kinds of settings that I would propose are becoming more common. This is Brazil, as photographed from above by drone photographer Johnny Miller. You can see the rich live on the right and the poor live on the left. This is Mexico City. Again, see how the spatial divide or distance between rich and poor isn't very large, but we can see the boundaries. They're marked, they're rigid, they look almost impermeable. And here, a little closer to home, is Detroit, Michigan. Now, I fully acknowledge that these are extremes, but I think that these are, that we can actually, with increasing frequency, find similar scenes across cities and suburbs across the Western world. When we look out from our insular social worlds, we just do not see much counter evidence to the meritocratic myth that is sold to us by government policies, neoliberalism, but also that's part of our culture, the books that we read, the movies we see, the inspirational stories that we tell ourselves and each other. So as such, it is social inequality itself that makes us less able to recognize it and unwilling to contest it. Now, let me conclude. If my analysis is correct, then democratic publics may be caught in a feedback loop where growing levels of inequality cause a greater disconnect between rich and poor, which in turn strengthens, not weakens, their belief in meritocracy. If we want to break that loop, it would require public policies that create conditions for interactions across the economic and income divide, and educational divide. Key to that challenge, I would argue, is to integrate the formative institutions in which young people begin to learn about their society. Not just the educational curriculum, but broader lessons about the society that they live in. Because in the absence of any exposure to economic diversity, young people will grow up with a naive understanding of their society in a world that is increasingly divided along socioeconomic lines. All right, let me enter. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was wonderful. So just to get us started, a quick question, which would have to do with the nature of your explanation. You've mostly emphasized spatial segregation and lack of contact between classes, which we know has been decreasing. I know from your dissertation research, you had a chapter where you looked at the impact of having a roommate from a different racial or class group on understanding about inequality and its sources and its fairness. I'd like you to maybe comment on this and maybe connect it to a broader question, which would be this. Meritocracy can be viewed as intention or better than corruption and clientelism. Most of us would rather live in a system where we're rewarded for our efforts instead of being dependent on clientelism to move forward. And, American exceptionalism would tell us this is a country of, fair competition. Yet we know that it's not a country of fair competition, since some of us start on first base and others on third base. So these are two tensions about meritocracy. It might be better because it's not corruption, but it could be worse because of this question of we don't have an even competition. So maybe you could comment on this and the impact, what you found in this chapter on roommates.
Yes, I'd be happy to. So as part of my dissertation research, I basically integrated data from college students across the country, where I was able to ask them questions about their understanding of inequality when they started college, and then look again at their views and their beliefs 4 years later by the time that they graduate. So that allows me to look at change in beliefs. And many students, they hold on to their original beliefs, but a fair number of them actually changes, becomes more believing in meritocracy, or becomes much more critical of meritocracy. So my question was, what is it about their experience in college that really sort of triggers that kind of belief change? And I found all sorts of correlations, for instance, looking at the kind of field of study that they pick. So your typical sociology student is going to be more critical of meritocracy than your typical business major. But those may reflect existing differences between those students predating their college experience, right? So I thought, how do we identify what it is that makes people change? And one aspect I looked at is the roommate that they are assigned, which is often on your typical American college campus. In the first year, you are just kind of randomly assigned to live with one or a few other students. And that experience, it turns out, can be quite pivotal and can make quite an impact in students' lives. So in my study, what I describe is how students, particularly minority students actually, when they're rooming with someone from a different racial or ethnic background, become much more critical of meritocracy, which I understand and explain in terms of kind of a reference group process, kind of comparisons that you're able to make, where you come to reflect on your own life and trajectory, and come to see perhaps some advantages that you had or some disadvantages that you faced that other people didn't. So it can be very enriching and lead to a better understanding of inequality in society, while it can at the same time also be quite confrontational and hard to cope with. So that is my research, and more generally, I try to look at the role of context and the role of peer groups, and that requires a mixture of methods and such. Michèle, your second question is a hard one, and I would think that indeed, as you identify, neither cronyism and nepotism is what people want, but a market competition that is unequally set up, that produces winners and losers, that justifies those outcomes very much in light, sort of in Michael Young's original understanding of what meritocracy is and does. Meritocracy is not a path to equality, it is a justification for inequality. It takes away people's grievances with their social position. It takes away their voice, any right to complain about their position, because they were given a fair chance. And Michael Young would say, and I would agree with him, that is particularly painful, because if you end up somewhere in society that was not your doing, that was structurally unequal, but everybody recognizes it as such, then at least you can complain, you can feel aggrieved, you can be mad about it, and people will understand where you're coming from. But if that right to be unhappy with your position is taken away from you, then you can only be mad with yourself, and I think that is a lot more painful and hard.
You've muted yourself, Michèle.
Sorry, would you like to throw in a question, one of you? Steffen, go for it.
Go ahead, Steffen.
Yes, thanks for your wonderful work, Jonathan. I mean, it sounds a little bit like a conduct theory applied to meritocracy. So contact theory claiming that, of course, prejudices diminish once you have contact across different class boundaries and so on. And here you would raise awareness for inequality issues. I think that is fine. I would like to point out another potential explanation, not as an alternative, maybe as an addition to what you have presented here. Some people would claim it's simply ideology. So it's also the period of neoliberalism. People were constantly told that the market does better and so on. The state should retrench and retreat from everything. I have developed a small argument in a little book that basically started with the observation that in Europe, many middle-class people started to have their stake in the market in terms of private pension provision, private spending for education, home ownership. And if you look at the micro associations on the individual level, then you see that people who invest privately in education move from being a tenant to a house owner, that these people become more skeptical of redistribution, they become more pro-market, maybe even more meritocratic. Isn't that an argument what one could also apply, that people's willingness basically to see themselves as an entrepreneurial self, advancing themselves, investing in their own, in their family and in their kids, rather than looking out for the state to correct certain inequalities. So just as an alternative, I think it's a good story, and I buy the story, but I would like to know your reflection on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Certainly someone's social mobility, like and the success they've achieved in their lifetime is very much provides them with a confirmation that indeed it is possible through hard work and talent, right? Because that is, of course, what you yourself embodied, and that is the kind of experience that often leads people for self-serving reasons, but sometimes also fully convinced that this has been their experience, so this must be true for everyone, to then support this idea that they live in a meritocracy. What is hard though about that argument is that certainly in the United States, for instance, recent decades have marked an enormous decline in absolute mobility. So whereas the baby boomer generation, about 90% of children ended up doing much better than their parents, economically speaking. For the current generation, it's basically 50-50, whether you're gonna go down the ladder or stay or climb up. So the reality of social mobility has become a lot harsher for many people in many Western countries, which would mean that those experiences that you describe are actually gonna be fewer and fewer. So whereas I completely agree that this would be something that leads people to become more believing in meritocracy, I don't think this could be the full story.
Michael, would you?
Yeah, Jonathan, yeah, I love the talk and I love the project and I find it very sympathetic. I begin with your observation, the one you made toward the end when you said that following Michael Young, that meritocracy is not a remedy for inequality, it's a justification for inequality. And I think that's very important. Now, some people will then accept that, but argue that it's a persuasive, defensible justification for certain inequalities, which in a way goes back to Steffen's inequalities, for example, based on differences in who works hardest or who contributes the most. But it's important, even before we get to those normative arguments, to recognize what you say and what Steffen in his paper also says, that meritocracy is not an alternative to inequality. It's a justification for a certain kind of inequality. I like your proposal, Jonathan, a lot, and I think that it's very important, the point you make, about how in recent decades, as inequality has deepened, it's expressed itself in those who are affluent and those who are of modest means leading increasingly separate lives, social separation and segmentation. I think that's hugely important. And I think any adequate response to the inequality that we have today has to include the proposal that you make about creating, you spoke of integrative formative institutions for young people, but also I'm assuming you have in mind creating class mixing institutions, common spaces and public places that bring people together across classes in a way that is not very common today. So I'm very much in favor of that and believe that needs to be at the center of any response to the inequalities that we face. My question is this. It seemed from the way you presented this proposal that the reason it was a solution, or the way in which it would help, is that by bringing people together across classes to confront one another in the way they live, it would make people more aware of inequality and therefore perhaps more critical of it. Is that the mechanism that animates the proposal? Or could the proposal to create more class mixing public spaces and public gathering places, that such a project constitutes a different kind of equality from the equality of opportunity that is embedded in the meritocratic idea? If we really did create common places and invigorate common places and public spaces that brought people together in ways that formed them, that impressed the sense in which we share a common life, that would itself constitute a kind of broad democratic equality of condition, if it succeeded, that would be an alternative to the project of equality of opportunity that underlies meritocratic competition. So is it mainly to make people more aware of the facts, to see how different are the life circumstances of rich and poor? Or does it constitute actually a mode of life that provides and expresses a different way of organizing society and bringing people together in a shared democratic citizenship? Jonathan, what do you think?
That's a great question, and thank you for synthesizing my argument so clearly. I think it's very much the latter. I think that there's a enormous value in integrating and creating public fora for interaction across the social, economic, educational divides that we know in our society. Other sociologists have called for more emphasis for libraries and other institutions, right, making sure they're accessible. I think that I definitely share that. I also think that more interactions will also equalize conditions very much. For that means sharing resources, right, not necessarily economic, but social resources, connections. Right. A lot of life operates that way. And yeah, and I guess I mean, this is not a fully original thought. I think when Daniel Bell, contemporary of Michael Young, good friend of him, former professor of sociology at Harvard, when he kind of accepted meritocracy as something striving for, and therefore very much disagreed with Michael Young, in proposing a just meritocracy, as he called it, he was very alert to saying, for instance, that inequalities in a particular setting may exist, inequalities between artists or scientists, but it's very important that we make sure that differences in outcome in a certain field don't translate to other fields, don't determine your worth as a person, don't determine your access to medical care, don't determine where you live and the precarity of your life. And those are extremely important conditions that obviously are not met in our current contemporary societies.
Yeah, great paper. Yeah, I love the project.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Now we're going to turn to Michael Sandel.
What I have to say about meritocracy is compatible, Michèle, I think, with what we've heard from Steffen and Jonathan and from you, but you'll tell me whether that's the case or not. I'd like to step back and say a word about the connection between the meritocratic ideal or the meritocratic faith and the authoritarian populist backlash against elites that we've seen in recent years in the US, in Britain, and in many European countries. Now, there are lots of accounts of what's animating the anger, the resentment, the grievances that have fed this backlash against elites. But I would like to propose that an important source of it has to do with a certain way of thinking about success and failure that's closely connected to meritocracy. In recent decades, the divide between winners and losers has been deepening, poisoning our politics, driving us apart. This has partly to do with the widening inequality that Jonathan just spoke about. The widening inequality that's come in after 4 decades of a market-driven version of globalization that we've seen. But it's not only the inequality. I think it has also to do with changing attitudes toward winning and losing that have come with it. Those who've landed on top have come to believe that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit, and that those who struggle, those who've been left behind, must deserve their fate as well. This way of thinking about success arises from a seemingly attractive ideal, the meritocratic ideal we've been discussing. The idea that if chances are equal or could be made equal, then the winners would deserve their winnings. There are 2 problems with this ideal. One of them is that we don't live up to it. We don't live up to the meritocratic principles we profess. At Ivy League universities in the US, despite generous financial aid policies, there are more students from the top 1% than from the entire bottom half of the country combined. So we know this. We know that the meritocratic ideal is imperfectly realized at best. But there's a further problem. And the further problem is that meritocracy has a dark side. The ideal itself is flawed. And the reason is that the closer we come to realizing the meritocratic ideal, the more it's the case that the winners can say to themselves, I earned it. My achievement is my own doing. And this generates hubris among the winners and demoralization, even humiliation, among those who are left behind. Now, how does this connect to the populist backlash? One of the most potent sources of the populist backlash against elites is the sense among many working people that elites look down on them. And I think they are right. I think this is a legitimate complaint. And it arose through the operation of a certain politics that we've seen in Western democracies over the past 4 decades. Even as globalization brought deepening inequality and stagnant wages, its proponents offered working people some bracing advice. We heard it time and again in politics. If you want to compete and win in the global economy, go to college, go to university. What you earn will depend on what you learn. You can make it if you try. These slogans became so widely accepted across the mainstream parties that they became obvious, almost cliched promises, reflecting a certain conception of meritocracy. And those who offered this advice, the elites who assured people, you can make it if you try. And Barack Obama used that phrase in speeches over 140 times, this meritocratic rhetoric of rising, through getting a university degree. What the elites missed was the insult implicit in this advice. Because if you didn't get a university degree, and if you're struggling in the new economy, your failure must be your fault. You didn't get a good enough education. But elites were tone deaf to the insult they were delivering, along with what they took to be the promise. So it's no wonder that many working people turned against meritocratic elites and believed, understandably, that elites looked down on them. Now, this politics, I think, is flawed. And it's flawed in ways that bring out the dark side of meritocracy. Those of us who spend our days in the company of the credentialed can easily forget a simple fact. Most people don't have a 4-year college degree. In the United States, nearly 2/3 don't. And the figures are similar in Britain and in most European countries. So it's folly to create a political project and to design an economy that makes dignified work and a decent life dependent on a college degree that most people don't have. So if something like this diagnosis is plausible, what it suggests is that we need to shift the terms of public discourse and focus less on arming people for meritocratic competition and focus more on the dignity of work, which connects with themes, Michèle, from your writings. Now, people will disagree, coming from different political and ideological traditions, what counts as affirming the dignity of work, what policies would renew it. But at least focusing on that question would give our politics and our political discourse a different shape, would begin to address, rather than to reinforce, the sense of anger and resentment and grievance felt by a great many people who believe that the work they do is not valued by the society in the way it once was. And this makes a difference, especially for center-left parties. The Democratic Party in the US, Labour Party in Britain, the Social Democratic parties of Europe all have undergone a shift almost without noticing it. By 2016, these parties were more oriented to the values and the interests of the credentialed professional classes, the meritocratic winners, than to the working class constituencies that once constituted not only their political base, but their primary reason for being. Traditionally, these parties had as their primary mission to defend the working class against powerful companies and the privileged. But in recent decades, in the US, in Britain, and France, the center-left parties, mainstream parties, basically alienated working class voters who had once been their primary source of support as they addressed the growing inequality brought about by the neoliberal globalization they themselves had supported, by responding to that inequality, not directly, but by offering individual upward mobility through higher education. And so this, I think, is the path, a fundamental shift in the way mainstream parties, especially of the center left, conceive their mission and purpose. Until they rethink that mission and purpose, I suggest, around issues of the dignity of work, and also along the lines Jonathan was emphasizing about recreating a vibrant class mixing public sphere, I think they will have a very hard time healing the polarization that is rife in democratic societies, much less reconnecting with the broader constituencies that were once their reason for being. Michèle.
Perfect presentation, Michael. Thank you so much. One question could be, what difference will the Biden government make? He has named Marty Walsh as Secretary of Labor. His economic team with Sissy Rouse and Janet Yellen are far more progressive. Is it going to be really different from the Obama administration in sensitivity to the celebration of essential workers? I mean, a lot of the challenge, I imagine, is not only engineering networks, as Jonathan mentioned, but also transforming narratives. And certainly the democratic, and your book certainly and creates conversation such as this one that at least makes the question of the salience of the dignity of work, on the table.
Right.
Do you think the Democratic Party will do that? And what difference do you think it might make?
I think it's an open question, Michèle, whether the Biden administration will succeed in shifting the basic frame, the terms of political discourse, along the lines we've been discussing. There are one or two reasons for hope. I think judging how progressive or mainstream are his appointees in a way doesn't really answer the question, because what's at stake here are competing definitions of what it means to be progressive now. Yeah. And because one strand of progressive politics is to double down on the meritocratic project and try to make it work better. And I'm suggesting that's a dead end. Yeah. And that focusing on the dignity of work and reconstituting the public sphere is more promising. Some glimmers of hope along this line, Michèle, is first a biographical fact. Joe Biden was the first Democratic nominee for president in 36 years without an Ivy League degree. Yeah. So this could make him a more intuitively capable of connecting with the aspirations of working people than his more meritocratically formed and insistent predecessors. Also, in support of that strand of hope, he did speak in his campaign less in terms of what in the book I called the rhetoric of rising. You can make it if you try. You should be, everyone should go as far as their efforts and talents will take. That rhetoric of rising loomed less large in his campaign than it did in those of Obama and Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton before him. And he did speak about the dignity of work, drawing on his own experience and so on. Now, whether those impulses and gestures translate into a rethinking of the mission of the Democratic Party, that remains to be seen. But there are some small strands of hope in that.
Yeah, thank you. Jonathan, Steffen? Go ahead, Steffen.
Thanks, Michael, and also congratulations on the German translation of your book, which came out a few weeks ago. I agree very much with what you said, and I share many of your observations. And I think one major problem with meritocracy is that it depends somehow on conditions that it itself cannot reproduce or organize. And in the long run, of course, it's an ideology for legitimizing inequality. And your argument basically says, so it's good for the winners of that story because they have the belief that it's all self-achieved, but it leaves those at the bottom, the losers of the whole process, basically without any good excuse. And it takes away also their moral dignity. I have done some research in East Germany where it was a worker society. So it was a dominant, let's say, cultural model to be a worker, to be part of an enterprise, to do handwork in a specific work context. And what most people report from the experience of transition was that they lost some kind of respectability, that they didn't feel, so in what they do, they did not feel recognized anymore. I think this is very central. And many of them still kept or maintained the idea of meritocracy despite very different experiences. So it was a kind of social schizophrenia. And this is very interesting that on the one hand, you still believe in meritocracy to some extent, but on the other hand, you are disappointed about yourself because you could not make it. You have no proper reason, no proper explanation for that, other than being responsible yourself. And I think, I mean, you explained that very well. I think this is one of the major issues for most lower classes, and that social democracy or the center parties turned away or turned towards a social investment state. You also have in your book all these different social reforms, which all emphasized social mobility, investment in education, climbing up the social ladder. And there was no alternative narrative available anymore. Either you do it, or if you don't succeed, then you are basically left on your own. And I think this is a very interesting story. So I have no proper question. I just wanted to reframe it from a German perspective. And I think that we can find a lot of traces and evidence that this is part of the overall story.
I do have one, I mean, this, we may have time later, Michèle, to discuss this, but for Steffen, there does seem to be one respect in which Germany has avoided one of the harsh edges of the meritocratic ethic that is seen in the US and in Britain. And that has to do with the role of higher education. In the US and in Britain, especially in the US, there is a fevered, frenzied attempt by parents in the top 20, 25% and their children to prepare themselves to compete under intense pressure to win admission to highly selective colleges and universities. And there is a steep hierarchy of prestige, not only in terms of earnings, subsequent earnings, but of prestige between higher education on the one hand and other forms of learning, including vocational and technical learning in the US. So not only is the pay unequal, but there's an inequality of recognition and esteem that's quite stark. And in Germany, my impression is that there is greater respect, greater investment in vocational training and education, and correspondingly, greater measure of honor and esteem for people who enter those fields. Or am I overstating that?
I mean, if you compare that to the US or to the UK, I think this is perfectly correct. If you look in longitudinal perspective where Germany came from, then I would say, of course, there's also an academic drift, so that middle class parents, they want to bring their kids to university, and there's a devaluation of manual work or so the classic vocational training. This is, so the problem is similar, but at a very different level.
Yeah, yeah.
But it still has very good trade training that does not exist in the US. Jonathan.
Yeah, this is actually a point that comes up often when I teach on the topic of social inequality or meritocracy more specifically. They are often shocked to learn how things are done in Germany, in the Netherlands, actually in about half of the European countries that I'm familiar with, where kids are tracked at the age of 10 or 11 in what is essentially a path that either leads to a vocational career or to university. So in a very real sense, yes, going to college is not an extremely competitive, stressful event, because the true selection has already taken place some 7 or 8 years before. And that is a kind of inequality that most of my American students, at least, have a much harder time accepting than the inequality that comes from competition that is in a sense, you could keep faith in making it at some point in your life, whereas in some ways your chances of going to college are very much decided much early on in a country like Germany and the Netherlands.
So the sorting, it's not that the sorting doesn't take place, it just takes place much earlier, and that shapes attitudes toward the experience of higher education. And there are advantages and disadvantages associated, Jonathan, as you suggest, with both. The disadvantages of the US system of sorting at the level of higher education become painfully evident to us. And this goes to what Steffen was saying. It's good for the winners, but not for the losers. Actually, it's not entirely good for the winners either, because the price that well-off families pay and their kids to enter into this intense competition for admission to selective colleges and universities, the price that we pay is converting the adolescent years into a stress-strewn meritocratic gauntlet that exacts a very considerable toll emotionally and psychologically on the winners, even those who prevail. And so by the time they arrive in these places, they are in many cases wounded by the experience of that hyper-competitive, high-pressure, achievement-driven experience that begins in adolescent years and often before. And the result is really to disfigure the kind of open-ended, exploratory, reflective possibilities of university years, because the habits of hoop jumping and networking and credential gathering have become so ingrained that they become hard to dispense with. And they do take the levels of depression and anxiety that we're seeing are at alarming rates. So the converting higher education into a sorting machine for a meritocratic society, which essentially is what we've done, is not only unfair to those who are left behind, it also exacts a not inconsiderable toll on the winners.
Exactly. I cannot resist to mention the work of one of our recent PhDs, Steffen Belgin, who compared high school students in Berlin and Boston and upper middle class students, that is, and found that the German kids felt far less pressure in terms of competition and conforming. And they would all often just take a gap year because they all had the spot guaranteed at the university. And they simply had to wait a little longer to get at the university they wanted if they were not ranked very high in their high school. So what it did in terms of the self-concept of the young upper middle class kids was quite significantly better in Germany than in the US. But arguably at Harvard, we'll probably have a particularly bad case of this, since our students tend to be extremely competitive and focused on getting there. So any other questions before we open it up to our audience? No? Okay, so I'll just choose, we have a lot of questions in the chat there. One from Elke Winter, who is the Mackenzie King Professor in Canadian Studies. She has a very simple but important question. Is redistribution the elephant in the room?
Well, I mean, I would say yes. I don't think we can really talk about meritocracy without talking about inequality. And I also think it's really hard to deny that lower levels of inequality would indeed produce a more equal, but perhaps also more fair society. And in fact, and this is maybe something we can talk a little bit more about the public conversation around these topics. But there's a scholar in the Netherlands, her name is Ingrid Robijns, and she has done really interesting deliberative work, maybe similar to what the work that Steffen has done, the research, where she explored the extent to which people intuitively feel that just like a poverty line, there should be something like a riches line, like a ceiling of how much wealth is acceptable. And indeed, she finds in the setting of the Netherlands that people do agree that something like 2 million euros is about what we should be allowing as the maximum amount of wealth that a person has. Now, we can talk about, of course, where to set that limit, but the notion that indeed there is public support for thinking in terms of limits to wealth and limits to inequality, I think is encouraging.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. In your deliberative studies, Steffen, have you found any reference to that? What did you find concerning attitudes toward redistribution?
Yes, I mean, of course, I mean, there's a lot of research out there on cross-national differences. Very often, this research suffers a little bit from context specificity. So, if you ask people, should the state distribute money or wealth, then people usually relate to their own society. So, in Sweden, interestingly, less people than in the UK say yes. But if you would move all the Swedes to the UK just one day and ask them again, then of course 90% will say, yeah, there should be a reduction of inequality. But what Jonathan mentioned is, I think, quite important, or also Michael said that with this class mixing public environments. So our deliberative forums, we're bringing together people from different classes. So they sat together in one room and discussed for 8-9 hours, and they went home for 2 weeks. And returned and discussed again. They got some information about inequality, taxation, and so on. And we have quite a number of people who shifted their opinion. So we had a quantitative survey before and afterwards. So they become more redistribution friendly. So the narrative, public debate, class mixing environments, all these things matter. And if social sorting takes place at a societal level, so at large, then of course people do not interact. We very often had the situation where these people sat together, one person on social assistance, social benefits, told a personal story. And that really made an impression on others who at the beginning said, yeah, I did a lot for myself, I deserve the money that I have and the wealth I have. And they said, yeah, okay, then you were ill and the situation with your kids. So that really makes people becoming aware that there are different lives out there, and that people, even if they try, will not succeed and cannot not succeed. So I think it's a very important issue. We have in Europe now these so-called citizens forums, where there's a lottery and people are simply selected to sit together, kind of public debates to decide on public issues. This is also a very strong and maybe successful learning environment, because you become active in society, you mix up with people with very different backgrounds and experiences, and you try to figure out a political solution to a problem. And we have that too little currently, and I think this is a very interesting experiment, mainly at the local level for the time being.
I know that in the US, James Fishkin, the political theorist, does experiments like this. And he finds, if I recall, Michael will correct me, that in fact, people they leave after 2 days and say, I've not changed my mind a lot. The polarization between Democrats and Republicans persists, although they say I've gained a lot more understanding in how people think differently than I do. Is that
maybe there's a threshold? So if the society is already very divided, then you need more effort, and maybe it's not as successful. But at least for our German democratic forums, and in most other countries, we also did that in Denmark and UK and so on.
Yeah.
There was quite some outcome of people changing their attitudes towards redistribution, inequality, and so on.
If I could just say one word, Michèle, about redistribution. I'm in favor of more redistribution, but focusing only or even mainly on addressing the inequalities we've been focused on through redistribution, runs the risk of leaving in place, leaving unchallenged, the presumption behind much redistribution, which is the results of the market, the income and wealth dispensed by the market, is presumptively, in some correspondence to merit or contribution, so that it's the burden on those who would redistribute that allocation to show that considerations of fairness, let's say, override considerations of who earned it. And so I think we have to find a kind of politics that enables us to discuss and to contest that background assumption. Which, so here would be a concrete example. In the book, I suggest a financial transactions tax, which many people might favor on redistributive grounds, on the grounds that people in finance who would be subject to a financial transactions tax are wealthy, and the beneficiaries, depending on what one does with the revenues, less so. So it's a way of shifting the burden of taxation from the rich to the poor or to the middle class. But that's not my primary reason for suggesting that we consider a financial transactions tax. It could also be justified on very different grounds, on the grounds that most speculative financial activities, though they generate enormous rewards to those who engage in them, don't actually contribute much, if anything, to the economy, to its productivity, or to the common good. And if that's the case, the reason for a financial transactions tax is to express a certain valuation of that activity as not really constituting a valuable contribution to the common good. Whether you design a high-speed trading system that enables transactions to take place a millisecond quicker, that doesn't really contribute to the common good, so it could be argued, and therefore the windfall that comes from that activity should be taxed for the common good. So I would like to look, insofar as we're talking about taxation, while redistribution is a desirable side effect, I think the even bigger stakes are the educative interests, the formative interest, to use Jonathan's phrase, in having a public debate that enables us to argue explicitly about what counts as a valuable contribution to the common good, and how should we embody those judgments in the way we design the economy. Otherwise, we will slide into the assumption, which is very widespread, that the money people make is the measure of their contribution to the common good. But this has to be, I think, at the center of political debate and contestation. And the way to do that is to propose, for example, to swap the payroll tax, which is a tax on labor, for a financial transactions tax, which is a tax on arguably unuseful speculative activities. So that's the only qualification or hesitation I would make, not about redistribution as such, but about the focus and the grounds and the reasons for a tax policy, let's say, that would have that effect.
That's very interesting. It reminds me of the carbon tax, right?
Well, it's, yeah, and the analogy, I mean, the dramatic analogy there, we do have certain taxes with an explicitly expressive purpose, so-called sin taxes, for example, on alcohol, let's say, or on sugary drinks, because we don't want people, we want to discourage that activity. It's not just that we want to raise revenue. We want to discourage the activity. So the question is whether one could, and this would be open to political debate, but whether a financial transaction tax could be seen and defended as a kind of a sin tax, or at least a judgmental use of the tax system to discourage certain activity, remunerative though it happens to be under the existing system, and to encourage other kinds of labor and contribution to the common good.
Yeah. So I think the conversation around essential workers certainly opened the door to this. Who contributes what? Which leads me to a question by Charlie Mayer, our historian, who says, should we be romanticizing work? Is it still the central theme in the contemporary world? We academics may love our work, but will the dignity of labor integrate society when 30 years on a job may just be dispiriting? So what do we make of this? Michael, do you want to take this on since you're—
Well,
I have views about it, but my colleague, Steffen.
I don't know whether we romanticize work. Of course, we live in a post-industrial society, so not in an industrial society anymore. The meaning, the content, and also the activities of work, they change quite a lot. And so the former types of work, they were always related to people's identity. So in terms of a profession or an occupation you had for your lifetime, basically. And this has changed quite dramatically. And I do not know whether there's a functional equivalent to that. So where could dignity come from? I would agree with Charles Meyer. We cannot return to the past. It's simply impossible. A social structural shift, changes in the labor market, the occupational structures, they are all there. But currently, basically, we lose a little bit of grip and also social cohesion if we do not offer anything that is taking the place of the dignity of work. It could be, I mean, what Michael mentioned, that contributions to the common good, a kind of civic engagement or the like, could also form a type of identity, because this is something people do voluntarily. They do that with a lot of passion. It plays a great role also in the public sphere and also for support of the neighborhoods, schools, and so on. Maybe this would be something to place more emphasis on. Whether the old type of work will return, I'm skeptical too.
The answer I would give to Charlie is that it depends what we think an economy is for. One traditional answer offered by Adam Smith and by Keynes was that consumption is the sole end of economic activity. But I think they were wrong about this. I think that an economy is not only a scheme for consumption, but also a scheme for social recognition, a way of integrating a society as a political association in a scheme, not only to organize productive activity, but also to allocate and confer honor and esteem and recognition so that people can see their contributions reflected back to them in the form of recognition, honor, dignity. And this in a way goes back to Hegel's idea of what an economy consists in. And I think he was right about this. So if something like this is right, then the proposal to solve the problem of work through a universal basic income, that's the risk is, or rather the challenge is, that if we decide that work is obsolete for a great portion of our society, and instead we say, well, we'll have a scheme of redistribution where everyone will be guaranteed a universal basic income, even if we could fund it, and even if that UBI were generous enough to enable people to live a decent life, which are big ifs, there would still be the further question whether we would be connected in a scheme of cooperation and contribution to the common good, whether mediated by the labor market or not, that enabled people to feel and to believe rightly that what they were contributing to the common project won them from the society dignity, honor, esteem, recognition. Because without that, I think we have a recipe for not only kind of anomie, but also a sense of the large part of a great many people of exclusion, because I think the idea here is the fundamental human need is the need to be needed by one's fellow citizens and to win recognition for answering those needs. So I don't think we can dispense with the contributive dimension of justice, focusing only on paying people a basic income and leaving it at that.
Yeah, and of course, in political theory, there's a long discussion around recognition and distribution. And in sociology, the interest in studying sociologically processes of recognition has grown rapidly. Jonathan, do you want to add anything to this conversation, or should we move on?
So I can keep it short, but basically, this also goes back to Michael Young in the book, which is a dystopian novel of a system of meritocracy that rises but then collapses when the populists revolt, the populists being a coalition between basically men from the lower social classes led by women from the higher social classes. So when they overthrow the regime, what they're calling for in their manifesto is a plurality of talents, of activities that should be equally respected and rewarded, right? So that would be another way to think about this, as elevating to the level of work with compensation, with recognition, etc., other activities like raising children or contributing to the arts. Or so I guess that would be another way to approach this very important matter of how we define production and how we make sure that people feel that they are contributing and that other people need them, which is indeed essential, I think.
Great, thank you. Well, this leads us to the next question by Britta van Staldwinen. If we think about gender and race-based inequality, many accounts suggest that women and racial minorities, to gain access to more social and economic opportunity, the dominant class of majority men must sacrifice some of their privileges. Some accounts even suggesting that this is a zero-sum process. So how would dealing with meritocracy address these gender and race-based dimensions of inequality, in your view? Is this zero-sum, and what does it require for white men to sacrifice? You are muted, Steffen.
Meritocracy, of course, requires that all people get an equal chance, regardless of their gender or race or age or different types of trades or affiliations. And so, of course, if you look at the overall distribution or allocation of privilege, then there should be a shift. But this shift comes in generational terms. So it basically does not affect the old privileged white male, but rather the younger. And there's a stronger competition. But I think this is part and parcel of the overall process. And this is the way our society has developed, that other claims come in, other people with good reasons and very justified say, we are not out of the game, we want to be part of that. Maybe this is a question for Jonathan. It would be very interesting to see whether gender and also racial differences matter for the belief in meritocracy. I would believe it does, that women are less committed to the principle, that is a male principle. And also disadvantaged, marginalized groups are probably a little bit more skeptical than others. So depending, so what matters here, whether it's race or whether it's a class issue. But that would be very interesting to think about a situation where new groups come in and do not carry the same kind of ideological imprint, or at least not as strong as those who are now at the top positions in society. That would make meritocracy a little bit weaker. Jonathan mentioned so different types of activities, caring activities, family, balancing work and life. These are all issues where you can find identity in. And I think if it becomes more heterogeneous, that would be very good. It would also be good for all the skepticism we put forward with regard to meritocracy here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just to echo or kind of respond to what Steffen was saying, indeed, these kind of surveys do tend to suggest that women on average are less believing in meritocracy, and racial and ethnic minorities too, with the exception of immigrants, who often are actually much more believing in meritocracy, which you could perhaps understand as being part of the immigration experience, where you go to another country with high hopes and aspirations. So that would be my sense of where the literature is at. But Michèle, I think this is kind of starting to be a great invitation for you to tell a little bit about your project, about where some of the generational change may lead to in recognizing plurality of worth.
Okay. Well, basically, I'm doing a project on Gen Zs where we're interviewing them about how they imagine the future. And we find that much of their commitment has to do with creating a society that is more organized around inclusion, sustainability, authenticity, and they are quite skeptical of the American dream, and they believe that producing or defining a life for themselves that is committed to realizing collective good is absolutely crucial. So we interviewed them before and during COVID, and we saw a clear increase in their commitment to collective orientation in the interviews we did last summer. And the other part of the project is in some ways very complementary to what Jonathan is doing. Together with my graduate students, we've interviewed over 160 people working in entertainment, stand-up comedy, cultural producers in a very wide range of sphere about the new scripts of self that they are creating that are very much in sync with what the Gen Zs are embracing, moving us toward a society that has a much more plural understanding of who's worthy, along the line of what Michael was suggesting, where, for instance, balance between work and private life is very much emphasized. And so the book that I'm writing, which is a book for a wider audience, will certainly argue that this is showing us an alternative to the American dream that has fed the souls of Americans since World War II, in part because growing inequality now makes this project of individual mobility much less dependable, and trying to create a society that is qualitatively different becomes more and more interesting, but also realistic to the extent that all these narratives, shows like Queer Eye or Transparent, a lot of what we watch, The Good Life, what's made available as we're all spending our evenings binge watching, is feeding our understanding of what the desirable life might look like. That is quite different from the Horatio Alger's vision of American society. But to go back, we have only a few minutes. Thank you, Jonathan, for asking the question. But now you maybe understand better why this panel was so important to me, given what I'm working on right now. But let's go back to maybe take one more question, which is a very basic question. And I think it's probably lurking in the mind of our audience. Liz Klima asked, while I agree with Sandel's book's characterization of the negative societal impact of an ethic based on winners and losers, I'm left wondering what in its place would provide individual motivation to realize one's full potential. And I'm choosing that question because when we teach Intro to Inequality, the basic theory explaining inequality, Davis and Moore, is precisely about this. If you don't give people higher rewards to take the more challenging and maybe unpleasant jobs, where do people find their motivation to work and to realize their full potential? So what are the implications of your respective conclusion for this very basic question? What will keep us going if we don't have meritocracy?
Well, you mentioned just now in framing the question, Michèle, that some believe that there would be no way of motivating people to undertake challenging or perhaps unpleasant jobs were it not for meritocracy. But it is a striking feature of the meritocracy that we have, that the most unpleasant jobs are remunerated generally the least, not both in terms of pay and in terms of social esteem. So it's a mistake to think that if we didn't have such a steep hierarchy of rewards, that too many people would want to be, too few people would want to be hedge fund managers, and too many people would want to be sanitation workers. The way the meritocracy works is actually the opposite from that. If I could, this is related, I suppose. Liz's question about individual motivation is, well, one other question is, do we think, therefore, Liz, that the reason we should pay hedge fund managers more than garbage collectors is to motivate them, in effect, to bribe them to use their talents for these more remunerative activities, out of concern that they would take on less demanding ones? Probably not. But could I quickly also address Britta's question?
Sure.
Removing barriers of race and gender, barriers to success, that's a morally important project of enormous moral importance. And it might seem the moral importance of that project and our commitment to it might seem to vindicate meritocracy as an ideal. I think maybe this is the unease lying behind Britta's question. But I think it's a mistake to see the removal of barriers and the moral importance of that project is vindicating meritocracy. It only vindicates meritocracy if you believe that a perfect equality of opportunity, if only we could achieve it, would be an adequate basis for a just society. But I think that's a mistake. It's a mistake for a number of reasons, some of which we've discussed today, including the fact that even a perfectly competitive, open meritocracy would create a society of winners and losers and generate attitudes corrosive of the common good, hubris among the winners, humiliation among the losers. So I think it's important to see the principle, not to abandon the principle of equality of opportunity or trying to perfect it or making it more real, but it's important to see it as a remedial principle. It's a remedial principle. It's not a self-sufficient ideal of a just society. And the other elements for bringing about a just society and a good society include some of the proposals that we've been discussing here today, including creating a broad democratic equality of conditions where whatever the success people achieve in a competitive market society, there are common spaces and public places that bring people together across backgrounds from different walks of life and to encounter one another, to bump up against one another, because this is how we learn to negotiate and abide our differences. And this is how we come to care for the common good. This is how we come to experience a common life. And it can awaken at least, or prompt perhaps, a sense of mutual obligation for one another. So I think one of the great misunderstandings in the debate about meritocracy is the assumption that if only we could achieve a more perfectly fair meritocracy, if only we could perfect the project of removing barriers and achieving truly equal opportunity, then we would have a just society. As I hear our discussion today, Michèle, I think we're raising some skepticism about that assumption.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much to the three of you. I would love to be able to continue, but I know at least Jonathan is teaching in 1 minute. I'll simply conclude by suggesting that you all watch Amanda Gorman's poems, both at the inauguration and at the football game on Sunday, because it is all about essential workers and about the very question we have been discussing about the worth of all human beings and how to achieve it. So I could not be more appreciative to the three of you for your really enriching and thought-provoking comments. I also want to thank the amazing team of the Weatherhead Center staff who always produce such a flawless event. I'm so thrilled to be working with them. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for making time, the three of you, and hopefully the conversation will continue in our private space as much as we can. So have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, Michèle. Thank you for convening.